Vanessa Carrington laughed straight into my father's face when he told her she was standing on his land. She looked at his old pickup, his dusty boots, his dark skin burned darker by 40 summers of sun, and then she turned to me and asked if he did maintenance work for the neighborhood. My father didn't argue. He simply reached into the cab of his truck, pulled out a plain envelope, and set it on the hood. 3 days later, Vanessa showed up at our front door, and she wasn't laughing anymore. Because inside that envelope was a notice that the road she kept calling the association's road was about to close. If you enjoy stories where an arrogant person digs their own hole, subscribe to the channel and watch Vanessa realize her mistake. It was the last week of August, one of those mornings where the heat hasn't arrived yet, but you can feel it waiting in the grass. My father, Calvin Pierce, 69 years old, was walking the eastern fence line the way he did every few weeks, hands in his pockets, eyes moving across the ground like he was reading something written there that nobody else could see. I had come back to town 4 months earlier to help him manage the property, mostly because my mother had passed the winter before, and I didn't like the idea of him out there alone on 27 acres with nobody to notice if he fell. I manage commercial construction projects for a living, which means I have spent 2 decades reading site plans and easement maps, and that morning my training started pinging before my father even said a word. Somebody had been busy on our land. There was a new sign bolted into a steel post at the mouth of the road reading Hawthorne Ridge Residence, only in crisp white letters on a deep green background. Behind it stood 2 camera poles on freshly poured concrete footings, the kind of footings that require a crew, a mixer, and at least a full day of work. And past those, spanning the asphalt itself, was an electronic barrier arm with a keypad panel mounted on a pedestal, still wrapped in a strip of protective plastic at the joint. None of it had been there 3 weeks earlier. None of it had been discussed with us. Nobody had knocked on our door, called our number, or mailed us so much as a postcard. My father stopped about 10 feet from the barrier and looked at it for a long time without saying anything at all. I have known Calvin Pierce my entire life, and I can tell you that his silence has textures. There is the silence when he is tired, the silence when he is amused, and the silence he used that morning, which is the one that means he is putting something in a drawer inside his head and closing it carefully. He crouched down, ran 2 fingers along the edge of one concrete footing, and rubbed the grit between his thumb and forefinger. Then he stood up, brushed his hands on his jeans, and looked back east toward the tree line where our fence ran. He said, "Donovan, somebody forgot where their property line ends." That was all he said. No cursing, no raised voice, nothing you could put on a poster. I pulled out my phone and started taking pictures anyway, because that is my instinct on any job site where work has been done without a signed change order. I photographed the sign, the footings, the barrier arm, the keypad panel, the tire tracks where a truck had pulled off the asphalt onto our grass and torn up about 15 feet of turf. While I was doing that, a white luxury sport utility vehicle came down the road from the direction of the subdivision, slowed, and stopped about 20 yards from us with the engine still running. It sat there for a full 30 seconds, which I noticed because 30 seconds is a long time to look at 2 men before you decide what to say to them. Then the driver's door opened. Vanessa Carrington stepped out in white slacks and a cream blouse, sunglasses pushed up into hair that had been done that week and probably every week before it. She was 52, expensively maintained, and she carried herself the way people do when they have never once had to wonder whether a room would take them seriously. Her eyes went to my father first, and I watched something happen in her face that I have seen 1,000 times in my life and never gotten used to. She catalogued him. Old man, work shirt, jeans, boots, dark skin, 20-year-old Ford, and she filed him under a heading she had already prepared, and after that nothing he said was ever going to get read. She walked toward us with her arms folded and asked, "Who authorized you to be working here?" My father turned around slowly, took his time about it, and answered, "Nobody, I own it." And Vanessa Carrington laughed. It wasn't a cruel cackle or anything theatrical. It was worse than that. It was the light social laugh of a woman hearing a child say something adorable and slightly ridiculous. She actually put her fingertips to her collarbone while she did it. Then she looked past my father entirely, as though he had finished being a person, and directed herself to me. "Can you explain to your worker that this is association property?" she said. I stood there for a second, letting that sit in the air where everyone could hear it. Then I said, "That's my father. I want to be clear about what happened next because it is the hinge of this whole story." She did not apologize. She did not get flustered. She did not say the thing that any ordinary embarrassed person says, which is, "Oh, I'm so sorry," I assumed. She shrugged one shoulder, glanced at her watch, and said, "Fine, then explain it to your father." My father didn't react to that either. He walked over to the barrier arm, tapped it once with his knuckle so it made a hollow aluminum sound, and asked, "Who paid for this?" Vanessa answered with real pride, which is the part I remember most. The homeowners did, she said. All of it, the barrier, the cameras, the monitoring contract, approved unanimously at the spring meeting. My father nodded slowly, looking at the footings and not at her. That's unfortunate, he said. Vanessa asked him what was unfortunate about a community investing in its own security. He didn't answer. He just walked back to his truck, opened the door, and waited for me. I got in. She was still standing in the road with her arms folded when we pulled away, and I could see in the mirror that she had already dismissed us and gone back to her phone. On the drive back to the house, I asked him if he wanted me to call somebody. He said not yet. I asked him if he was angry. He said anger is expensive and he was on a budget. Then he asked me to pull the metal box out from under the seat of the truck, the one with the dented corner that had been riding around in that cab since I was in high school, and he told me to open it. Inside were papers in plastic sleeves, and that was the morning I finally understood what my grandfather had built and what my father had quietly protected for 34 years. The Pierce family has owned that ground since 1951. My grandfather, Otis Pierce, bought it in pieces over 11 years. A parcel at a time, working 2 jobs and a third on weekends in a county where a black man buying land was not merely difficult, but actively discouraged by everyone from the bank to the neighbors. He had to use a white attorney as an intermediary on the first 2 purchases because the seller refused to sit in a room with him. That is the kind of detail that gets left out of the pleasant history the subdivision tells about itself. By the time he was done, he held 27 acres running along the ridge, with a creek at the bottom and a stand of hardwoods that he refused to sell to a timber company twice. Hawthorne Ridge did not exist then. It did not exist for another 30 years. When a developer finally assembled the tract on the far side of the ridge in the late 1980s, he had a problem that every developer in that situation has, which is access. His subdivision sat on high ground with one workable connection to the county road on the western side, a winding 2-lane thing that added a solid 15 or 20 minutes to any trip toward town. What he wanted was a straight shot east to Millbrook Highway, because a straight shot to the highway is the difference between houses that sell and houses that sit, and every foot of that straight shot ran across Pierce land. The developer offered to buy it. My grandfather said no. The developer offered more. My grandfather said no again. He was 71 years old by then, and he had spent his life learning that the one thing nobody could take from him by argument was a deed with his name on it. But he was not a spiteful man, and he understood that a road that helped 100 families get to the highway was not a bad thing to have on your land. So, instead of selling, he did something that his attorney at the time called unusual and that I would call visionary. He granted a private access agreement. The terms were plain, and they were recorded, and they were binding on the association that the developer eventually created to take his place. The association got the right to use a road across Pierce property for the benefit of Hawthorne Ridge residents. In exchange, first, the association bore all maintenance costs for the roadbed and surface. Second, no permanent structures, improvements, or fixtures could be installed on the Pierce parcel without the written consent of the landowner. Third, the association could never represent, publicly or in any recorded document, that the road was association property. Fourth, the association had to keep liability insurance naming the landowner as an additional insured, with a current certificate delivered on request. And fifth, if the association committed a material breach and failed to cure it within 30 days of written notice, the access rights could be terminated under the agreement. My grandfather died in 1992. My father was 35, and the deed and the agreement passed to him, and he kept both in a metal box under seat of a truck because that is where he kept everything that mattered. For 34 years, he did not make one single problem out of any of it. The association mowed the shoulder, patched the asphalt, and used the road, and he waved at the cars. Twice he let them widen a turning radius. Once he let them run a drainage culvert. Both times they asked first, in writing, and both times he said yes without asking for a dollar. There is no version of this story where my father was looking for a fight. I want to be precise about the stakes because the whole thing collapses into fantasy if you get them wrong. Closing that road would not trap anybody. Hawthorne Ridge would still have its western connection to the county road, fully paved, fully passable, an emergency route the fire department had used before. Nobody would be sealed in. What would happen instead is that 106 households would suddenly find their commute to the highway swollen by 15 to 20 minutes each way, that delivery routes would be rerouted or dropped, that the school bus loop would have to be redrawn, and that every one of the 11 homes listed for sale that autumn would show buyers a closed gate on the way in. In a neighborhood built on convenience and appearance, that is not an inconvenience. That is a number on every appraisal. My father knew all of this. That is what I understood sitting in that truck with the metal box open on my lap. He was not holding a weapon. He was holding a responsibility, and he had held it gently for 3 decades, and the woman who had just laughed in his face was about to find out that the entire eastern half of her community's identity rested on a signature she had never bothered to read. The letter came on a Thursday. It was on association letterhead addressed to Calvin Pierce, and it was a formal violation notice with a fine attached, $350, payable within 14 days, for what it described as unauthorized commercial activity adjacent to association property. I read it twice at the kitchen table and then laughed out loud, which is not something I do often. Our house is not in Hawthorne Ridge. It has never been in Hawthorne Ridge. It predates Hawthorne Ridge by 4 decades. The association had exactly as much authority to find my father as I have to find the state of Nevada. My father came in from the barn, wiped his hands on a rag, and read it standing up with his reading glasses low on his nose. "They're finding me for standing on my own land," he said. Not really as a question. "Looks like it," I said. He folded the letter along its original creases, slid it back into the envelope, and handed it to me. "Keep the letter," he said. And that is the thing about Calvin Pierce that Vanessa Carrington never once considered. He does not shout. He does not threaten. He does not go stand in somebody's driveway at night. He collects every letter, every email, every date, every name, filed in order, because a man who grew up watching people lie about what they said learns early to make sure there is always a piece of paper that remembers. 9 days later, he drove down to the hardware store the way he had every week for as long as I can remember, and the barrier arm did not go up. There was a security guard in the little pedestal booth now. A young man named Trevor with a clip-on tie, and Trevor got out looking miserable because he had watched that same truck go through that same spot 4 times a week since he started. He said, "Mr. Pierce, I'm sorry, I've got a list and you're not on it." My father said that was all right and asked him whose list it was. Vanessa arrived within 6 minutes, which told me she had asked to be called. She came up to the driver's window and did not lean down, so she was speaking to the roof of the cab more than to my father. "From now on, residents only," she said. My father asked, "And who told you that?" She said I did, with the flat satisfaction of a woman who enjoys the sound of that sentence. She added something else then, and I have turned it over in my head many times since, because it is the exact place where this stopped being a misunderstanding. She said, "Your father should be grateful we even let him use this entrance." She said it to me, not to him. He was sitting 3 feet away with his hand on the wheel, and she talked over him about him. I did not answer her because I had learned by then that my father's silences were doing more work than my words would. He looked up at the big stone sign that said Hawthorne Ridge with the little brass plaque underneath about community standards. Then he looked at me in the passenger seat. "Donovan, take a picture," he said. I took 11. Then he backed the truck up, turned around in his own field, and drove the long way to the hardware store, and he did not say one word about it the entire trip. I decided to try the reasonable path because I still believed there was one. I called the association office and requested a slot on the agenda of the September board meeting to discuss what I described as a boundary and access matter. The secretary put me down without asking a single question. Later I learned that Vanessa had been told about my request that same afternoon and had approved it immediately, and I understand exactly why. She thought she was scheduling an execution. She thought 2 men were going to stand up in a room full of her neighbors and embarrass themselves, and that afterward nobody would ever bring the subject up again. The meeting was in the clubhouse, in a room with a low ceiling and folding chairs and a coffee urn that somebody had let go bitter. There were about 20 residents there, which for a routine September meeting is a good turnout, and I suspect some of them had heard something was coming. Vanessa sat at the center of the head table with a leather portfolio in front of her. To her left sat Martin Hill, the treasurer, 61, a retired regional manager for a plumbing supply company, a man with a careful face who kept his pen capped until he had a reason to uncap it. My father wore a clean-pressed work shirt and carried a plain accordion folder under his arm. He sat in the second row and rested his hands on his knees like a man in church. When our item came up, Vanessa did not introduce us by name. She said, "These gentlemen apparently believe Hawthorne Ridge's eastern entrance belongs to them." A few people chuckled. Most did not. I remember watching Martin Hale's eyebrows come down maybe 2 millimeters, which is the treasurer equivalent of a fire alarm. My father stood, walked to the front, and set the accordion folder on the table in front of Vanessa. She looked at it the way you look at a plate of food you didn't order. She did not open it. She did not touch it. She turned it 45 degrees with one finger so it sat squarely, and then she began to ask questions. "Mr. Pierce, are you a surveyor? No. Are you a real estate attorney? No. Do you hold any professional license relevant to land boundaries? No, ma'am. Then perhaps," she said, "we should listen to people who actually understand these matters rather than relitigating a road this community has maintained for 27 years. And my father said in a completely even voice, "That's probably a good idea." She took that as surrender. I watched her take it as surrender. She smiled at the room the way a woman smiles when she has just proven her point without breaking a nail, and she said, "That road has served this community for 27 years. Your father cannot simply wake up one morning and decide to claim it." She was addressing me again. She had done it 4 times in 3 weeks, and every single time she did it in front of witnesses, and by then I had stopped being surprised and started being useful. I stood up. "He didn't wake up and claim it," I said. Then I let it sit for a beat because in construction you learn that the pause before a number is worth more than the number. "His name has been on the deed for 34 years, I said. "And his father's name was on it for 41 years before that, which means the Pierce family owned that ground for 75 years before this clubhouse had a foundation." The room changed temperature. It is a real thing, and I felt it. Somebody in the back said, "Wait, what?" Martin Hale uncapped his pen. He leaned forward and asked with, "Mr. Pierce, may I see the folder?" And Vanessa put her hand flat on top of it. She said the association's attorney would review any documentation through proper channels, that a board meeting was not the venue for legal claims, and that she was not going to allow the agenda to be hijacked. Martin sat back slowly. I noticed he wrote something down, and I noticed he did not look at Vanessa while he wrote it. My father picked up the folder, tucked it back under his arm, and started for the door. Halfway there he stopped, turned and said, "You have 30 days, Vanessa said. 30 days for what?" My father said, "You'll get it in writing." And then we left, and the clubhouse door swung shut behind us on a room that had gone completely quiet, and out in the parking lot my father exhaled once, long and slow, and said the coffee in there was terrible. That was the entire debrief. 3 days later, a certified letter arrived at the association office from Evelyn Brooks, a real estate attorney in town who had handled my grandfather's affairs at the end and my father's ever since. Evelyn is 46, speaks about 4 words for every 15 a normal attorney uses, and has the calmest voice I have ever heard on a telephone. Her letter did not threaten anybody. It simply listed things that had happened. It stated that the association had installed permanent improvements, specifically an electronic barrier assembly, 2 camera poles set in poured footings, and signage upon land owned in fee by Calvin Pierce, without the written consent required by the access agreement. It stated that the signage asserted control over property the association did not own, in direct violation of the provision barring any representation of ownership. It stated that the association had, through its agents, denied the landowner access to his own property on a specific date at a specific time. It stated that the association had failed to furnish a current certificate of insurance naming the landowner as additional insured, despite a written request delivered in July, and it stated that the disturbance of turf and subgrade along the eastern shoulder constituted unauthorized alteration of the servient estate. Then it listed what my father required: remove the barrier assembly, remove the cameras and their footings, remove the signage, restore the disturbed ground to its prior condition, deliver a current certificate of insurance, and execute a written acknowledgement suitable for recording, confirming that the roadway lies upon land owned by Calvin Pierce and used pursuant to the access agreement. 30 days to cure, exactly as the agreement provided. And a final line, 1 sentence, no adjectives, stating that failure to cure within the cure period may result in termination of access rights under the terms of the agreement. Martin Hale told me later that he read that letter standing at the office counter and had to sit down. He said the part that got him was not the legal language, it was the insurance. He was the treasurer. He had been signing checks for a monitoring contract on cameras that were mounted on somebody else's dirt, with no coverage naming that somebody, which meant that if a delivery driver had clipped that barrier arm and gotten hurt, the association's exposure was an open question, and his name was on the budget that created it. Vanessa's reaction was 1 sentence. "They're bluffing," she said. The association's attorney, a semi-retired man named Doyle who handled their routine work, did not agree. He asked to see the original recorded agreement, pulled it from the county records himself, read it twice, and then asked Vanessa what she had authorized to be built and when. She told him the barrier project had been approved in the spring and was a matter of community security. He asked whether anyone had run a title search or ordered a survey before pouring concrete. She said the entrance had been the association's entrance for 27 years and she was not going to be lectured. And then she said the sentence that Martin has repeated to me twice since, both times shaking his head. She said, "You're telling me an old man in a pickup truck controls our front entrance." And Doyle, who had no dog in the fight in about 11 months until retirement, said, "I'm telling you his deed says he owns the land underneath it." That was the first real turn. That was the moment when the story stopped being about whether my father was right and started being about how much it was going to cost Hawthorne Ridge to find out. She should have folded there. Any reasonable person folds there. But I have spent enough time around boards and committees to know that people rarely defend positions, they defend the version of themselves that took the position. Vanessa Carrington had spent 6 years building an identity inside that neighborhood. She was the woman who fought the rezoning on the north parcel. She was the woman who got the entrance landscaping upgraded. She was, in her own repeated phrasing, the guardian of property values, and elections were in November, and she was going to run for a 4th term. To admit now that she had authorized nearly $40,000 of association money to be spent building a security installation on land belonging to a man she had publicly mocked, and that the same man could lawfully cut the neighborhood's fastest route to the highway, would not be a mistake. It would be the end of the only public identity she had. So she doubled down, and she did it in the worst possible way, which is in writing. She sent an email to the full membership. I have read it many times, because it was later projected onto a screen in that same clubhouse. It referred to an outside landowner attempting to disrupt our community through aggressive legal tactics. It did not name my father. It did not mention that the barrier had been built without consent. It did not mention that the association's own attorney had reviewed the recorded agreement. It asked residents to stand united and to direct any inquiries to the board president. And it included a line about not allowing outside parties to hold Hawthorne Ridge hostage, which is a remarkable thing to write about a man whose only demand was that you take your equipment off his grass. Then she did the thing that finished her. She hired a surveyor, her own surveyor, paid with association funds, no board vote, under a discretionary line item for professional services. She was absolutely certain it would come back her way, because 27 years of habit had convinced her that the world worked the way she remembered it. The crew came out on a Tuesday and worked the eastern approach for 2 days with a total station and a stack of county plats, and on Thursday afternoon they drove their stakes. I was there when they set them, standing at the fence with a coffee, and I did not say a word to anybody. The line came out of the tree line, crossed the shoulder, and ran west. The first stake with its bright orange ribbon went in about 4 feet east of the barrier pedestal. The second went in behind the north camera pole. The third came out past the residents only sign, and the line kept going, straight through nearly the entire eastern stretch of asphalt, 400 and some odd feet of pavement, every square foot of it inside my father's boundary. The crew chief walked over, looked at his tablet, looked at the barrier, and said to nobody in particular, "Well, that's a problem." Martin Hale called me that evening. It was the first time he had ever called me. He said, "Your father was right." I said, "He already knew that." There was a pause on the line, and then he said, "Vanessa doesn't know I called." And I told him the truth, which was that he should probably tell her before the 30 days were up, because the 30 days were not a negotiating tactic, and my father did not make idle statements. Martin said he would try. He also told me, in a lower voice, that he had gone back through 3 years of minutes and could not find a single vote authorizing permanent construction at the eastern entrance, only a vote for enhanced entry security, and that the specifics had been left to the president's discretion. She did not remove the barrier. That is the part I still find hard to explain to people. With her own surveyor's stakes in the ground, her own attorney advising her, and her own treasurer telling her the association's position was indefensible, Vanessa Carrington instructed the contractor to leave everything in place. She told him that removal would be premature and that the matter was under legal review. 72 hours remained on the cure period. My father spent one of those days replacing a water heater in the barn and the other 2 clearing brush along the creek. On day 27, she came to our house. She had never been to our house. She parked her white vehicle at an angle in our gravel drive, walked up the porch steps in shoes not built for gravel, and knocked on the frame of the screen door. My father was in the kitchen. He came out drying his hands on a dish towel and did not invite her in, but he did offer her the good chair on the porch, which she did not take. "Calvin," she said, using his first name for the first time, "let's be reasonable," and my father said, "I've been reasonable for 27 days. She had a folder of her own this time. She proposed that the association purchase the roadway outright, a strip acquisition, clean and final, no more disputes, and she slid the sheet across the little table. I read it over his shoulder. The number was $18,000 for a permanent easement across 411 feet of frontage that connected 106 households to a state highway. It was not a low offer. It was a message. It said, "I still do not think you know what you have." She must have seen something in his face because she added, "It's asphalt, Calvin. Let's not pretend you're sitting on Manhattan real estate." My father looked at the paper for a while. He did not tear it. He did not crumple it, which honestly would have been within the range of human behavior. He picked it up by the corner, held it out to her until she took it back and said, "Then you won't miss it." That was when she lost her footing, and she lost it the way people like her always do, by turning the person she has decided is the real decision maker. She said to me, "Talk sense into your father," and I had been waiting 3 weeks for that, so I did not rush it. I said, "Why do you keep talking to me when the deed has his name on it?" She said, "Because I assumed you were the reasonable one." And I said, "No, you assumed he wasn't worth listening to." Nobody spoke for maybe 4 seconds. A truck went by out on the county road. Vanessa's jaw worked once, and I watched her decide not to answer, because there was no answer that did not concede the whole thing. She said something about how she had always treated everyone in this community with respect, and my father, who had said nothing at all since he handed the paper back, finally spoke. 3 days, he said. Then he went back inside and let the screen door close, and she stood on our porch for a moment before she walked back to her vehicle. The cure period expired at midnight on a Sunday. No barrier removal, no signage removal, no insurance certificate, no acknowledgement, no response of any kind from the association's president, though Doyle had sent 2 emails and Martin had sent 3. Evelyn Brooks reviewed everything on Sunday evening, confirmed that every notice requirement had been satisfied and every cure window observed, and told my father that the termination provision was available to him. She also told him, and I want to include this because it matters, that he was under no obligation to use it and that walking away would cost him nothing but the money he had already spent. He used it. On Monday at 8 in the morning, a licensed fencing contractor from 2 counties over pulled onto our property with a trailer and set to work entirely on Pierce ground. Nobody dug up the asphalt, nobody broke pavement, nobody created a hazard, blocked a hydrant, or touched a single piece of association equipment because Evelyn had been extremely specific about all of that. They set 2 galvanized posts, hung a 14-foot gate, chained it, and mounted a sign that read in black on white, "Private property, access suspended," with the parcel number and Evelyn's office line underneath. It took 40 minutes. My father watched from the tailgate of his truck with a thermos of coffee. At 8:20, the first residents reached the gate and turned around. I watched a silver sedan sit there with its blinker going for almost a minute, as though the gate might reconsider. At 8:45, a delivery van came down, stopped, and its driver got out and photographed the sign before rerouting. By 9:10 there were 6 vehicles doing 3-point turns in a space designed for none because the navigation apps had not caught up and kept feeding people down a road that now ended. At 10, according to Martin, the association office had 11 voicemails, and the western route was carrying a volume of traffic it had not seen in 27 years, and somebody had already used the phrase emergency meeting. Vanessa arrived at 10:40. She got out of her vehicle and walked toward the gate and stopped because my father was standing on the other side of it. That detail is the whole story in one image. For weeks, she had seen him standing outside her boundary, an old man in the wrong place. Now the gate was between them and he was inside his own line, and she was the one standing on the outside looking in. She said, "Open this gate." He said, "No." She said, "You can't do this." And he reached through the bars and handed her a copy of the recorded access agreement with 2 paragraphs marked in yellow and said, "Your lawyer says I can." She read it. I could see her eyes moving. Then she looked past him at me, and I did not say anything at all, because there was nothing left to say that the yellow highlighter had not already covered. She walked back to her vehicle and made a phone call, standing in the road with one hand on her hip, and my father screwed the cap back on his thermos. The emergency meeting was Wednesday evening, and the clubhouse could not hold everyone. People stood along the back wall and out into the hallway. Vanessa was at the head table, but she was not the center of it anymore, because Doyle had brought a second attorney, a woman from a firm in the city who specialized in easements and who spoke for 19 straight minutes without once raising her voice. She explained the recorded agreement. She explained the survey, which was the association's own survey, commissioned and paid for by the association. She explained that the landowner had provided proper notice, that the cure period had run, and that the association's position was, in her words, without a viable defense. Then she put the emails on the screen, the July insurance request, Doyle's 2 unanswered messages, Martin's 3, Vanessa's instruction to the contractor to leave the barrier in place dated 4 days before the deadline, and the membership email about an outside landowner, which read very differently now that everybody in the room knew who the outside landowner was and that his family had held that ground since 1951. Martin Hale asked the question directly. He said, "Vanessa, why didn't you remove the barrier?" And she said, "Because I wasn't going to let them bully this association." And the attorney from the city said, with no particular heat, "They asked you to remove association equipment from their land." The room went completely silent. I have been in a lot of rooms and I have rarely heard one go that quiet. Then a woman about 4 rows back stood up and asked, "So why are we paying for your mistake?" And after that it was not a meeting anymore, it was a reckoning, and Vanessa kept trying to turn it back toward my father, calling him unreasonable, calling the closure retaliatory, and every time she did it fewer people were listening. She came to our house on Friday, no vehicle parked crossways, no security, no folder. She parked at the end of the drive and walked up, and she stood at the bottom of the porch steps rather than the top. My father was in the good chair with the newspaper, she said. Mr. Pierce, it was the first time she had ever called him, that he folded the paper and set it on the rail and waited. She said, "Please." He still didn't say anything, and then she said the sentence that this whole thing had been walking toward from the first morning by the fence. "Please don't permanently close the road." I was standing in the doorway, and I am not going to pretend I felt nothing. The woman who had laughed in his face and asked if he was maintenance was standing in our gravel asking a favor, but my father did not look satisfied. He looked tired. He asked her to sit down, and this time she did, and he went inside and came back with 2 glasses of water, one of which he handed to her, and if you want to understand Calvin Pierce, that glass of water is the entire man. He told her he had no interest in closing the road permanently. He said he had never had that interest, that 106 families getting to the highway was a good thing, that his father had thought so too, and that the only reason the gate existed was that she had spent 30 days telling him his name on a deed meant less than her title on a letterhead. Then he laid out his conditions, and Evelyn put them in writing the following week, and they were not the conditions of a man looking to get rich. The association would remove the barrier assembly, both camera poles and all footings, at its own cost. The association would restore the disturbed shoulder and turf to its prior condition using a contractor of my father's approval. The association would execute and record a written acknowledgement the roadway lies on Pierce land and is used only under the access agreement. The association would deliver a current certificate of insurance naming the landowner as additional insured and maintain it annually thereafter. The association would pay the legal fees my father had incurred, which came to a little over $9,000. The association would send a correction notice to every household clarifying that the earlier membership email had misrepresented the facts. And the president would not going forward make any representation on behalf of the association regarding ownership of Pierce land. $18,000 had been her offer to buy him out. He asked for none of it. He did not ask for a purchase price, a license fee, a toll, or $1 of rent, and Evelyn told me privately that she had suggested a modest annual consideration and he had waved it off. What he asked for beyond the list was one personal thing, and he asked for it plainly, sitting in a lawyer's office with Vanessa on the other side of the table and Martin beside her. He said he wanted an apology, not to me. She started to say something about a regrettable misunderstanding, and he stopped her, not sharply, just held up one hand. He said, "Tell me what you actually did." She sat there for a long time. Her hands were flat on the table, and she was looking at them. I could see her assembling and discarding 4 or 5 versions of a sentence, the ones that would let her keep something, and I watched her run out of them one by one, and finally she said, quietly, "I treated you like you didn't belong here." My father nodded once. He said, "I don't need to belong there," and then he tipped his head toward the window, toward the ridge, toward 27 acres his father bought a parcel at a time from people who would not shake his hand. "I belong here," he said, that was all. Vanessa did not respond, and I do not think there was a response available to her. He never asked her to resign. I want to be clear about that, because when I have told this story, people always assume it, and the truth is better. He did not care about her position, he had never cared about it, and the only time he ever mentioned it, he said that a title she gave herself was not his business. But the residents of Hawthorne Ridge had a business of their own, and it was the October meeting, and they came. Martin Hale moved to place the presidency under review. Vanessa defended herself well for about 6 minutes. She talked about 6 years of service, about the landscaping, about the rezoning fight, and some of it was true, and some of the people in that room had benefited from it. Then the documents came out again, this time compiled and indexed, and the picture they made was simple enough that nobody needed an attorney to read it. She had been informed of an ownership dispute before construction began, in a letter she never opened. She had been advised by the association's own counsel, and it overruled him. She had commissioned a survey with association funds and buried the result when it came back against her. She had directed a contractor to ignore a cure deadline, and she had spent roughly $41,000 of member money building improvements on land the association did not own, which then had to be removed at further member expense. The vote was not close. She lost the chair by a margin I will not print, and she did not stay for the rest of the meeting. There was no arrest, no lawsuit against her personally, no dramatic collapse. She still lives in Hawthorne Ridge. She still drives that white vehicle. What she lost was the one thing she had actually been protecting the entire time, which was the standing that let her look at a man in a work shirt and decide out loud in front of witnesses that he did not get a vote in his own affairs. Social power is a strange asset. It is enormously valuable right up until the moment everyone can see exactly how you used it. Martin Hale became interim president and then won the seat outright in November, running unopposed. He signed the new agreement with my father in Evelyn's office on a Tuesday morning, and afterward he shook my father's hand for a good 5 seconds and said he was sorry it had taken a closed gate to make him speak up. My father told him that most people never speak up at all, and that he had called before the deadline, and that this counted for something. The gate came off its posts the same week. The road reopened at 7 in the morning on a Thursday, and by 7:15 the traffic was flowing east toward the highway like nothing had ever happened. A few weeks later I drove that stretch with my father in the passenger seat, which almost never happens because he does not like being driven. The barrier was gone, the pedestal was gone, the camera poles were gone, and the footings had been broken out and hauled away and the turf reseeded so carefully you had to know where to look. In their place, set back on the shoulder where the agreement allowed it and where the county sign ordinance permitted, was a small sign my father had paid for himself. It read "Per Private Road," and underneath, in smaller letters, "Off Community Access." I asked him if it felt good, if there was any satisfaction in it at all, any small warm thing he was keeping to himself. He laughed, which he does not do often, and said, "For what?" I reminded him that Vanessa Carrington had stood in that exact spot and laughed in his face when he told her he owned the ground she was standing on. He looked out the windshield at the road running down toward the highway and said, "Some people don't hear you until the truth costs them something." I asked him what would have happened if she had apologized that first morning. If she had just said, "I assumed wrong, I'm sorry, sir," he said, then none of this would have happened. No letters, no lawyers, no gate, no meeting, no vote. He would have signed a consent form for the cameras, probably, and told them where to put the footings so they missed the drainage. It would have cost her one sentence and about 4 seconds of discomfort, and instead it cost her association $41,000 and $9,000 in legal fees, a removal contract, a correction notice to 106 households, and cost her personally the only thing she had ever really been building. We came out at the highway, and I looked back in the mirror at the roofs of Hawthorne Ridge sitting up on the ridge in the late afternoon light. 106 families who had come within a hair of losing their fasted home because one woman was too proud to open a folder that had been set down directly in front of her. Nobody in that neighborhood had done anything to my father. Most of them had waved at his truck for years. It took exactly one person with a title and a certainty to put all of them on the wrong side of a gate. Vanessa Carrington looked at my father and saw an old black man standing in the wrong place. What she never understood was that he was not standing in her neighborhood at all. The whole time, from the very first morning, she was the one standing on his land.